Hello Year 9, and thank you so much for tuning in to our first online teaching session on our brand new unit, which is on Gothic Horror. Gothic Horror stories, so you're thinking about stories to do with fear, violence, threat, probably a wee bit of the supernatural. You might be looking for vampires or ghosts or werewolves, certainly some sort of threat which brings an emotion of fear. And which we often associate with kind of Halloween. And you'll know, you've been introduced a wee bit to that in our study of A Christmas Carol with the ghosts of Marley and the three ghosts who come to visit Scrooge during his time of, redemption from being such a horrible person. Not all of the horror stories we look at in this unit, however, will have such a positive ending, and the one we're going to start with today certainly doesn't. So as I said, I suppose one of the most important features of a Gothic horror story is that there must be an element of fear. The reader must feel terrified by some presence in the story, and that is often best facilitated if we have an innocent and helpless victim. And that's really important, that there is often a child, sometimes a woman, sometimes a kind of weak, unsuspecting man who is threatened by an external force that they have no fault in. That you will often find that the case in Gothic horror. It's an innocent victim who encounters this terrifying external threat and is powerless against them. Other words you're going to be thinking about when we're thinking about fear are terror, intimidation, peril, which means there's sort of the threat of death, danger, menace. And other synonyms like this. You should be thinking of different words you can use to express that sense of fear which many of the protagonists in our stories will experience. So this first story we're going to look at together is nice and short, and it's a beautifully contained horror story. It's a bit of fun as well, about two innocent, helpless victims called Susan and Ned. And the story is called Axe Murder Hollow. A fantastic title for a story, which really builds a sense of intrigue. Intrigue is where the reader is left wondering what happens. So the title builds intrigue. We wonder what's going to happen to these two protagonists. So I'm going to read it for you, and then we're going to go back and annotate it together. So listen carefully. Susan and Ned were driving through a wooded, empty section of highway. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, the sky went dark in the torrential downpour. "We'd better stop," said Susan. Ned nodded his head in agreement. He stepped on the brake, and suddenly the car started to slide on the slick pavement. They plunged off the road and slid to a halt at the bottom of an incline. Pale and shaking, Ned quickly turned to check if Susan was all right. When she nodded, Ned relaxed and looked through the rain-soaked windows. "I'm going to see how bad it is," he told Susan, and went out into the storm. She saw his blurry figure in the headlight, walking around the front of the car. A moment later, he jumped in beside her, soaking wet. "The car's not badly damaged, but we're wheel deep in mud," he said. "I'm going to have to go for help." Susan swallowed nervously. There would be no quick rescue here. He told her to turn off the headlights and lock the doors until he returned. Axe Murder Hollow. Although Ned hadn't said the name aloud, they both knew what he had been thinking when he told her to lock the car. This was the place where a man had once taken an axe and hacked his wife to death in a jealous rage over an alleged affair. Supposedly, the axe-wielding spirit of the husband continued to haunt this section of the road. Outside the car, Susan heard a shriek, a loud thump, and a strange gurgling noise, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness. Frightened, she shrank down into her seat. She sat in silence for a while, and then she noticed another sound. Bump, bump, bump. It was a soft sound, like something being blown by the wind. Suddenly, the car was illuminated by a bright light. An official-sounding voice told her to get out of the car. Ned must have found a police officer. Susan unlocked the door and stepped out of the car. As her eyes adjusted to the bright light, she saw it. Hanging by his feet from the tree next to the car was the dead body of Ned. His bloody throat had been cut so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. The wind swung his corpse back and forth so that it thumped against the tree. Bump, bump, bump. Susan screamed and ran toward the voice in the light. As she drew close, she realised the light was not coming from a flashlight. Standing there was the glowing figure of a man with a smile on his face and a large, solid, and definitely real axe in his hands. She backed away from the glowing figure until she bumped into the car. Playing around when my back was turned, the ghost whispered, stroking the sharp blade of the axe with his fingers. You've been very naughty. The last thing she saw was the glint of the axe blade in the eerie, incandescent light. So here we have all those features that we talked about that are essential for a good Gothic horror story. We have two innocent victims who encounter this threat, this awful ghost that they've heard rumours about. The ghost of an enraged husband. And the husband, of course, it's quite clear, kills them both. What we're going to do now is look through the story more closely and see if we can find any language features which the writer has used to create an engaging and terrifying story. And as I work my way through it, I'm going to annotate, which means write words around the outside of the story, and I would like you to do the same with your own copy of the story. I'd like you to annotate it, to look through, find those language features, write notes in the margins, and when you're finished that, you can stick it into your classwork books. So let's get going. So looking again at the opening of the story, it begins by telling us that they're driving through an empty section of highway. That word empty is of course an adjective. It's a describing word which tells us about the setting of this story, and the fact that it is empty creates a clear sense of isolation. And you know that's very important for horror, that the characters must be alone, unprotected, and therefore more likely to fall into danger. As we read on then, we read that lightning flashed, thunder roared, and the sky went dark in the torrential downpour. And if you know your language features well, you'll know that this is rule of three. We have three parts to this description: the lightning, the thunder, and the sky. And all of those things use weather to create an ominous atmosphere. And when the weather is used in that way, you might remember this from A Christmas Carol, it's called pathetic fallacy. So that pathetic fallacy, where weather is used to create mood, creates an ominous atmosphere. And ominous, of course, means dangerous or scary. And that pathetic fallacy does that. When it's raining, when there's thunder and lightning, we're more on edge. Susan and Ned would be more afraid and terrified. And so this all helps to build that sense of horror. As we read on then, we hear that Ned has to suddenly stop the brakes because the weather is so bad. And in this part of the story, we read he stepped on the brake. Suddenly the car started to slide on the slick pavement. They plunged off the road and slid to a halt. Now those three words are all verbs. They are doing words. So those are powerful verbs which create a sense of drama and show the escalating danger. Escalating means it's increasing. This escalating danger that Susan and Ned are in as they're forced to stop the car. Then we have this description of Ned. We're told that he is pale and shaking. And again, those words are adjectives which show Ned's fear, his increasing fear, as he worries about what they're going to do. Reading on then, of course, they begin to discuss about the way ahead, what they're going to do. Ned gets out and checks, and he identifies the source of the problem. We're wheel deep in mud. And that's very important, that there is a problem which must be overcome. And of course, in this case, the problem separates Susan and Ned, they are then left even more isolated and therefore more prone to danger. Of course, as a result of that, then Susan swallowed nervously, and that is an adverb, which is an adjective which describes a verb. So it describes how Susan swallowed. She swallowed nervously, and that of course increases the fear, increases the sense of peril, that something awful is going to happen to Susan. And it's at this point then that the reader gives us the backstory, this awful backstory about the man who had hacked his wife to death in a jealous rage. Backstory is an excellent method that can be used in Gothic horror to show that the danger is more real. If there's a rumour going around that this happened before, or people have heard of incidents like this happening, then it makes it more credible, which means more believable, more likely to happen. So that backstory increases credibility and therefore makes it much more threatening. We then return to the drama of the story, and we're told that outside the car, Susan heard a shriek, a loud thump, and a strange gurgling noise. And of course, that is once again rule of 3. We have 3 descriptions there: the shriek, the thump, and the gurgling noise. And when an author uses the sense of hearing in this way, which is very, very powerful, we call it auditory. Think of the audio on your TV, auditory imagery. It means a description of sounds, and all of those sounds are highly threatening and foreboding. Foreboding means we, as the reader, have the sense that things are only going to get worse. A sense of foreboding, that the characters are headed for certain death in this case. So those sounds, the shriek, the thump, and the gurgling noise, all infer or suggest that things are getting much, much worse. That auditory imagery then is continued through this wee line here. She noticed another sound, bump, bump, bump. And I love that bit. Those are dramatic one-word sentences, which once again, of course, use auditory imagery. And here there's another sense of intrigue, a sense of the unknown. What is it that's causing this bump, bump, bump? Very, very threatening. And just because we don't know what it is, that of course creates even more horror and threat and fear. And of course, at this point, the threat becomes real. It becomes tangible, something that we can actually see. And it is poor Ned, the dead body of Ned, and his bloody throat has been cut so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. What a horrible image. That, of course, uses gore, right? Gory means there's a lot of blood, and visceral imagery. Visceral imagery means if it involves blood and guts and you just want to look away, it's visceral. It's something that's terrifying and that really stays with the reader. And at this point then, that bump, bump, bump is repeated, repetition. And that of course reveals, this is a revelation, reveals the source of danger from before and the source of fear, that this is Ned's body bumping against the car. Susan at this point then hopes that that police officer has finally arrived, but of course it's the ghost. The ghost was speaking to her before, and at this point we have a final rule of 3 which is used to describe the axe. This is a large, solid and definitely real axe. And that delays, it slows us down, delays the revelation of the weapon, which makes us feel even more on edge and increases tension. Tension is so important in stories like this that we feel we're on the edge of our seat, just waiting to see what's going to happen next. And at this point then the ghost actually speaks to Susan, Does her playing around when my back was turned, you've been very naughty. And of course, this creates an intimidating, it's humorous as well, but certainly intimidating and menacing tone, as poor Susan is left completely alone and unable to defend herself. And the story ends, the last thing she saw was the glint of the axe blade in the eerie, incandescent light. And it's quite clear what has happened, but the author doesn't tell us explicitly, and therefore it ends on a cliffhanger, where we don't know whether Susan has survived. It seems unlikely, but we don't know for sure. And that cliffhanger, of course, increases the suspense and that real fear which Gothic horror stories should create. So make sure you have all of that marked onto your copy of the story, and as soon as you have that finished, stick it into your classwork book and take a photo of it and upload it, please, to Google Classroom. Thank you so much, Ina. I hope I haven't scared you too much, and you'll be getting another task soon. Thank you. Stay safe. Bye-bye.